Hello, people. Finished a book. The Sword of the Prophet. The Mahdi of Sudan and the Death of General Gordon. Uh, this is kind of like refresher stuff for me. I mean, when I was in my teens, I was reading about the Mahdi and the prisoners of the Mahdi and, Gordon and Khartoum and the battle by Omdurman. Uh, I mean, who wasn't reading that when they were in their teens, right? I got that King book. I couldn't even get out of the room. They have a room that's all Africa stuff, and Egypt and the Sudan and all of that is in Africa. So that's where I got this. I thought it would be better. It was okay. I would give it like a 6. Fergus Nicoll is the author's name. Published in 2004. I paid $9.50 for it. 240 pages. It probably would have been 200 pages if this author didn't insist on printing entire Arabic names, entire Egyptian names, entire Sudanese names. Some of these names go on, it's a whole line that it takes up. They're unpronounceable. Nobody's ever going to remember those names. This isn't a textbook. I don't see why we needed those names. Towards the end of the book, maybe the last 100 pages, I had trained myself to just scan right past them names. Last paragraph, page 89. Oh, it's a big paragraph. Oh, okay. Notwithstanding the prudent precaution of hoarding the firearms and keeping them out of the hands of tribesmen whose loyalty had not yet been proven, this was a tactical mistake that would not be rectified until the siege of Obeid later that year, when even Muhammad Ahmed was persuaded that men armed with spears and sticks could hardly be expected to prevail against rifles. And what the author's talking about there is, as they would, the the Mahdists would win a battle, and they would, find all these rifles laying on the field, but he wouldn't let them use the rifles until later on. Rapid-fire Nordenfeldts artillery. For now, though, his fighters used swords, spears, and even throwing knives. These wicked-looking triple-bladed weapons, cut from a piece of steel, came originally from the Zande people in the forests of Central Africa to the south. The rank-and-file Ansar were not above assimilating any practical weaponry into their arsenal. Cavalry horses were given rudimentary protection with quilted armor. Select leaders had the real thing, armorers beating out ringlets for chain-mail tunics. From Darfur in the west came the inspiration for plate metal helmets, complete with chain-mail fringe and cotton padding. From the blacksmith's forges, too, came new swords, especially the cascara, a straight meter-long blade, its steel often acid-etched with propitious designs, thrust into a leather scabbard of flared design. Several tribal chieftains even wore genuine medieval armor that had somehow made its way down to Sudan in the centuries since the Christian Crusades in the Levant. Europeans who encountered such anachronistic visions always reacted with astonishment. Pretty much the Ansar, which is what they call the Mahdi's armies, fought with spears. Uh, they had swords. They probably all carried a dagger. But as this rebellion went on, And as they defeated more and more Egyptian garrisons, they got artillery, they got Remingtons, they got uh, Martini Henrys, they got all kinds of very useful weapons. And I eventually, I don't know if they ever got good with them, but eventually it became a factor in some of these battles. I don't know what the fuck's going down. Something's going on down by the road. I have my own spear here. I'm going to have to walk down to the road and see what the fuck's going on. Egyptian conscripts. First hand account on page 141. The troops were working at elementary drill and tactics and making some progress, but the officers were, as a rule, ignorant and incapable of grasping the meaning of the simplest movement, unwilling to assume any responsibility and totally devoid of initiative. Many of the troops had superstitious ideas regarding the power of the Mahdi, and others thought that the Khedive had only sent them to Sudan to get rid of them. They were dressed in long white cotton shorts and native cotton trousers. Most of them wore coarse leather sandals. Each man had a gray overcoat and hood. The infantry were all armed with Remington rifles. The tactics of the Egyptians in the presence of the enemy were to form battalion or double company squares. The troops were formed in 3 ranks to give them confidence. Each man was provided with 4 or 5 crow's feet, iron spikes with 4 points, which he was instructed to throw in front of him on the approach of the enemy. And those crow's feet, the Romans used to call them caltrops. And I think, if I remember correctly, the Romans used a caltrop. It was designed to fuck up a camel's foot. And they, that's where they used them, was in the desert. Probably where they got the idea from, too. Pasha Hicks' initial victory, first-hand account, page 144. Hicks was a British officer that they sent to try to relieve some of the garrisons, not only Khartoum, but he was to relieve a whole string of garrisons. And since Pasha Hicks had primarily, probably 95% Egyptian troops, it didn't work out so well. When they held their ground and listened to orders and did what they were supposed to do, the Egyptian troops were fine, but they panicked. This is, Pasha Hicks has a victory, an initial victory. Breaking from cover, the enemy sweeps with an inward curve right and left, his extreme flanks converging towards the opposing angles of our square. Now, file firing commences from the front directly assailed, the men having been cautioned to aim low. Near they swept, horse and foot closing on either flank. But as they came within our zone of fire, they butted forward, hit to death. The Nordenfelts have now got to work, and within a few minutes the leading mob fell in piles. But fanaticism knows no check. The chosen chiefs of the Mahdi were there, followed by their own chosen henchmen. They staggered to the front to break into a furious gallop straight for our death-dealing square, while in the rear swiftly sped the faithful spearmen. Onward they came, waving their banners inscribed with the Mahdi's own rendering of the Koran, right up to the cannon's mouth, right up to the rifle muzzle. Dauntless they rode, encouraging their followers with the promise of paradise to break our square. The Nordenfelts and Remingtons are no respecters of creeds or fanatical idiosyncrasies. Sheik after sheik went down with his banner, although the Mahdi had assured each he was invulnerable, and their faithful but misguided followers fell in circles around the chiefs they blindly followed. Page 212, near the top. This is something completely different. something that I had to stop and Google because I had never heard of it. They're talking about Wolseley, and Wolseley is in command of another relief expedition. Wolseley decides to, well, he does both. He sends a cross-country group, and he also goes down the Nile and tries to get to Khartoum. He chooses the Nile because he has done these river expeditions before. And in 1870, he had transported 1,400 men over 600 grueling miles through the Canadian wilderness along the turbulent Red River to prevent the USA gaining control of Canadian territory. 1870. I had never heard of that. I had to Google this, and it looks pretty interesting. I don't know that I would ever find a book for that, since I buy a lot of my books at used bookstores. Americans, that you're just not going to find something like that. I'm the only one that reads that kind of stuff. So, if you want to see something interesting, Wolseley, 1870, Canada. I had no problem finding it on Google. Third paragraph, 224, and this is near the end. Wolseley almost gets there, but Gordon is doomed. And by the way, there is a movie about Gordon. Charlton Heston plays Gordon, and Charlton Heston at the end comes down the steps and gets a spear right in the chest. I don't know if old Chuck would have been interested in playing Gordon had he really read up on Gordon, because Gordon was kind of a weird guy. He liked to surround himself with effeminate, very young subalterns. Third paragraph. News of the fall of Khartoum sent a convulsion through British society. Sir Charles Wilson's token force aboard the Bourdian and the Tel El Haween, 20 red-coated men of the Royal Sussex Regiment, and 240 Egyptian and Sudanese troopers, arrived at Tuti Island early on 28th January. At the junction of the two Niles, Ansar fire became too intense, and the plumes of smoke still rising from Khartoum made it all too clear what had just happened. Never in history was there such a race, General Wolseley reflected much later, rueing the only failure of his career. About 1,800 miles up the Nile from the sea when we lost at the post by a neck. At the time, he was traumatized. It's always weird to read up the Nile when you think about where the Sudan is, because the Sudan is south of Cairo and everything else, south of the Mediterranean. So naturally, I would think that was down. But when they say up, of course, they're meaning upstream. The Nile runs north. I don't know. It just seems odd to have a river running north. But the Rhine runs north. And anyways, I wrote Kut after the end of that, because as I was reading this, I said earlier in the video that when I was in my teens, I had read about this stuff. I couldn't recall whether Wolseley had just missed his opportunity to save Gordon, or if I was thinking of the siege of Kut, K-U-T. And Kut was something that was in the First World War, where the British, I believe the guy's name was Townsend. I could be wrong about that name. But he was trapped with his men in the village of Kut. And it was the Turks that had him surrounded. And he held out as long as he could, and there was a rescue operation steaming up this river, and they just barely missed. Townsend had to surrender with all his men. The Turks really treated him horribly. Thanks for watching.